A long time ago, I saw a meme or Facebook post or something that said that while Breaking Bad, Taxi Driver, and other similar works should definitely be considered great, if someone says one of these things is their favorite, you may want to be careful, as they might see some of these anti-heroes as truth tellers, folks who do what needs to be done, or otherwise aspirational figures. The Punisher takes things a step further, as it's been co-opted by military, police, militia groups, and other problematic groups who seem to be doing so in a way that treats him as a hero. This is especially scary, as no one in their right mind would want cops to operate as judge, jury, and executioner in the manner of Frank Castle. A few weeks ago, I stumbled on a Reddit thread that was full of people claiming that these groups co-opting the Punisher and his logo clearly had never read the comics, and that Frank Castle would never support the militia groups in question. One person even commented on how frustrating it is that their favorite comic character had been ruined by these people. Others claimed that the Punisher wouldn't hesitate to kill the cops who used his symbol if they deserved it, and would never take the life of a two-bit criminal down on his luck, or a drug addict doing what he needs to do to get by. Almost without fail, when I see internet discourse where someone claims that people who interpret a comic book character differently than them haven't read the comics, it's pretty obvious to me that the person writing the post at best read exactly one writer's take on the character, and more often than not is just regurgitating something they heard third hand from a video essay or that guy at a comic book store who's a little too excited to talk to you about pre versus post 0 hour continuity. So I decided to read exactly one writer's run of the Punisher in order that the next time the Punisher discourse comes up on the internet, you can regurgitate my opinion. To be fair, I have read several Punisher runs in the 20 years that I've been reading comics. I've read the entirety of Matt Fraction's Punisher War Journal run that launched during Civil War. I've also read all of Greg Rucka's excellent Punisher book, a good chunk of Nathaniel Edmondson's run, and of course, Jason Aaron's terrific 12-issue run from a few years ago. I think I read at least one volume of Garth Ennis's Punisher Max many years ago, but I don't remember much of it. Of course, you might notice that most of the Punisher stuff I've read is modern. It was written in a world where the writer was aware of the pushback that the character has gotten in recent years, as well as how the symbol has been co-opted. Rucka's run, my favorite, sort of treated him as a force of nature, actively hindering the police's investigation at times with his murdering and telling more of a story about the supporting cast than the Punisher himself. Edmondson went in with the mission statement that Frank was the kind of person who would deal with problems too big for the cops, but too small for superheroes. And Jason Aaron had him working for the Hand while retelling his origin to establish that even before his family was killed, Frank was kind of a monster. While these runs certainly have their fans, most Punisher fans point to Garth Ennis's work with Steve Dillon on art as peak Punisher. Granted, they're often talking about the Punisher Max stories, but those aren't on Marvel Unlimited. Not to mention, if we're talking about the platonic ideal version of a character, if that's something that even exists, it makes most sense to look at a version from the main 616 continuity. And if we're talking about what I think of the versions that most inform the comic book characters, I often turn to the early 2000s, especially Marvel Knights. All that is to say that I read all 49 issues of Marvel Knights Punisher that started with the Welcome Back Frank story in 2000 by Garth Ennis with Steve Dillon on art. For what it's worth, the Welcome Back Frank storyline did show up on Tom Brevert's working list of great Marvel stories on his Substack recently, so this is definitely considered a pretty good Punisher story by at least some fans. The first 12 issues are pretty solid, and I don't feel bad recommending that you check that first run out. It introduces some characters who show up throughout the series and tells a very Garth Ennis style story. After being away for some time, Frank returns to New York and sets out to take down the mob. After he starts doing some damage, the NYPD, who is totally in the pocket of the mob, creates an anti-Punisher task force. Unfortunately, all the cops love the Punisher because he kills criminals, so that task force is one down on his luck, Detective Martin Soap. Over the course of Ennis's run, we learn that Soap is an orphan. This comes up when a lady comes into the bar talking about how she was forced to leave her child at the same orphanage right around the time Soap was born. Just when you think that they're going to realize that she's his mother, they go back to her place and have sex. That's Garth Ennis for you. The next most Garth Ennis-y thing is that at one point the woman in the mob is mauled by bears. So for the remainder of the series, she is shouting orders with no arms or legs. But some of the big ideas on who is the Punisher from the comics are pretty straightforward. He's treated as a vigilante who does what must be done. While he's called a crazy murderer and everything, it's in a very early 2000s, look at how cool this guy is way. At one point, when the other tenants in his apartment building learn his secret, they team up with him, and the young woman talks about how he gives her hope. Whether he's pro-cop is unclear. Cops are definitely pro-him, but also the cops in this book are 100% in the pocket of the mob, so not the sort of people we would want to be cops in the real world. I wouldn't call this a pro-cop story. What is also clear here is that he does not want others to take up his cause. A major thread in the second half involves 3 copycat Punisher wannabe types. Mr. Payback hunts down billionaire CEOs. The Holy is a priest who murders people after they confess to crimes. And the Elite is a fascist who murders anyone he suspects might bring down the property value in his neighborhood. When Frank confronts these 3, he points out that the Elite is a Nazi, Holy is a lunatic, and Mr. Payback has accidentally killed an innocent woman named Maria Lopez. He then opens fire and kills all 3 of them. This moment is really important to how we look at Frank Castle's character. If you see him as a heroic character, your takeaway is that unlike the 3 copycats, he's got perfect judgment and isn't biased like the Elite. He's completely sane, unlike the Holy, and he never causes collateral damage like Mr. Payback. Alternatively, if you see Frank as a more complicated and flawed character, it's telling that he has no self-awareness, that he does have some fascist ideas. He could probably use some therapy, and there 100% is collateral damage to his war on crime. In a vacuum, I think authorial intent leans more toward the former, in which case you could see how people who want to be a real-world Punisher, unaware of their own biases, insanity, or potential collateral damage, might try and co-opt the image for their own purposes. So it's no surprise why insane racists who don't care about how much they harm others might do so. But this isn't the end of Garth Ennis's run. After the first 12-issue volume, Ennis returns for an ongoing that runs 37 issues, including a few stories by other writers. Ennis's bizarre sense of humor continues Soap's incestual relationship with his mother and escalates. First he has sex with his sister, then the only thing worse than incest, he has sex with a dude. And finally, what's worse than having sex with a dude? A transgender woman. Yes, this was definitely the early 2000s. There are a number of gay panic, transphobic, and fat jokes peppered throughout the run that take you out of the experience. Nothing more extreme than one would expect from something trying to be edgy in the early 2000s, but it's still a bummer that deserves to be mentioned. The first few arcs kind of run together. He runs into Daredevil, Spider-Man, and Wolverine. At one point, he nukes an island of arms dealers, lots of killing mob bosses, and the like. When he teams up with Wolverine, he's extremely aware of Wolverine's healing factor and at various times shoots him in the face and even in the balls. If you're into that sort of thing, it's fun and shocking and silly in a very Garth Ennis style. We return to the Who is the Punisher theme in issue 20 with the Brotherhood arc. The most important part of this arc is the way it's bookended. Frank has a monologue saying how he could never be a cop. Working the system, frustrations, I's to dot, T's to cross. And then the story is about a pair of horrible human beings who happen to be cops. Andy, who steals cocaine from drug busts to help pay off gambling debts, and Mike, who is a violent alcoholic that beats his wife and complains about the potential of a cop losing their pension for shooting unarmed civilians. There are other dirty cops and mob connections and everything else you expect from a Punisher story, but the mission statement remains the same. Frank doesn't kill cops. He struggles with it, and ultimately the dirty cops and mob bosses kill each other, but it ends with him admiring cops trying to do the right thing. It's a compelling story. Frank has his doubts, but sticks to his code. On the surface, especially if you're a 22-year-old with a Fight Club poster in 2002, it seems like we should take it as a book admiring cops and justifying any actions as the result of being in an impossible situation. But I think there's a little more nuance here, especially looking at Punisher's character holistically. Welcome Back Frank begins with him murdering a junkie for telling his friend that he's considering selling drugs left over after Frank took out the dealers. But that's completely off limits when it comes to Andy just because he's a cop. Though he demonstrates a little more self-awareness, he's just as biased as Elite was, letting cops off the hook when two-bit criminals and drug addicts doing whatever they need to survive get no such mercy. As a reader, it's not super clear if this hypocrisy was the author's intent, but it does seem to be there in the text. The next notable story, Hidden, is pretty messed up. A cult leader who went crazy as a kid when his obese mother sat on him and died is rounding up homeless men to help murder and eat people. A side note, I haven't read too much Punisher Max, but if this Marvel Knights run is supposed to be his toned down PG-13 stuff, I'm not sure I need to see Ennis really being able to let loose. The interesting thing about this story is that Frank teams up with a social worker who is critical of his methods. She points out that it's terrible what happened to his family, but that speaking with a therapist might be a healthier way to deal with that trauma than killing criminals. She also makes it clear that he's literally targeting homeless people who need help, not punishment. And in the final fight, Frank even gives them a chance to leave with a cringe-inducing inner monologue saying, "That's the trouble with talking to liberals. They get to you if you're not careful." One of my favorite arcs in the run is Streets of Laredo. It's your prototypical a stranger comes to town story. Frank shows up in a small town trying to take down some arms dealers. We get a colorful cast of characters, including the owner of the hotel he stays at, who Frank has sex with, a gay sheriff, a homophobic reverend, the sheriff's boyfriend, and said boyfriend's mother, the arms dealer. There are a few barroom brawls and things come to a head when the sheriff's boyfriend gets killed in a hate crime. I'm a little more willing to forgive the bury your gays trope in a book where pretty much everyone gets killed, and the ending is pretty satisfying. The run winds down with a pretty bad story about Daredevil, Spider-Man, and Wolverine trying to take down Frank once and for all that features some of the most off-model drawings of Wolverine that I've ever seen. I'm wondering if the fill-in artist, whose name I won't mention as to not put them on blast, was trying to draw Hugh Jackman or something. It was simply bizarre. And the final shots are a little 9/11 tribute that feels weird today, but probably felt essential in a book about New York in the early 2000s. So what was the point of all this? Who have I decided that Frank Castle is once and for all? Is he meant to be a hero, a flawed metaphor, a problematic fave, or something that doesn't work in the context of 2025? More than anything, I think he's a fictional character, and even when zooming in on one writer's take of that character in a very specific place and time, he's not always the same fictional character. If you stop focusing on one specific run, he becomes unrecognizable. Between issues, I jumped back to Frank and Wolverine's first meeting in an early issue of Punisher War Journal from the late 80s, and Frank was much more unsure of himself and treated more as a straightforward hero who just happened to kill bad guys. You can call some of these contradictions character development, but I would just call it another writer's interpretation of the archetype. For me, the Punisher is never meant to be taken literally. He's a meta-commentary on the logical extremes of a world with superheroes. He's a metaphorical way to strike fear into the hearts of enemies. He's a cautionary tale of what it looks like if you think you've got a perfect sense of right and wrong. He's a revenge fantasy and a vehicle for torture porn. and he's a symbol that can be used to project the creator's or fans' own prejudices, insanity, and short-sightedness. If you're a fan of the Punisher, there's nothing wrong with that, but I do think it's important to be aware that there are some ideas in some of his comics that actually do align with those of the various groups that have co-opted his imagery. I say this as a Punisher fan. I checked my math and I put him around number 8 in my top comic book protagonists, but he's not a perfect person. He's not an aspirational figure. He literally kills a heroin addict for being addicted to heroin in one of the last issues of Ennis's run. Anyway, I guess that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching and keep reading those comics.